So we're going to go ahead and continue on with Where the Red Fern Grows. It's been a little while since we read, but do you remember the last time we read? We found out that there was an accident in the woods with Billy and the Pritchard boys, and Reuben, the oldest Pritchard boy, accidentally fell on an axe and was killed, and that's where we left off. A few days later, on his way back from the mill, one of the Hatfield boys stopped at our place. He told me my grandfather wanted to see me. It was unusual for Grandpa to send for me, and it had me a bit worried. I figured he wanted to talk to me about the death of Reuben Pritchard. I always enjoyed talking to my grandpa, but I didn't want to talk to him about Reuben's death. Every time I thought of him, I lived the horrible tragedy all over again. After a practically sleepless night, the next morning I started for the store. I was walking along, deep in thought, when little Anne zipped by me. She was as happy as a young gray squirrel. Do you hear the simile there? She wiggled and twisted, and once she barked at me. I looked behind me. There was old Dan trotting along. He stopped when I turned around. Little Anne came up to me. I scolded them and tried to explain that I wasn't going hunting. I was just going up to the store to see what my grandpa wanted. They couldn't or didn't want to understand. I picked up a small stick and slapped my leg with it. In a deep voice, I said, "Now you go home, or I'm going to wear you out." This hurt their feelings. With their tails between their legs and trotting side by side, they started back. Every little way, they would stop and look back at me. It was all too much. I couldn't stand it, and I began to feel bad all over. "Well, all right," I said. "Come on, you can go. But Dan, if there are any dogs around the store and you get in a fight, I won't take you hunting for a whole year, and I mean it." Although I knew I really didn't. They came running, tickled to death. Little Anne took one of her silly spells. She started nipping at the long red tail of old Dan. Not getting any reaction from him, she jumped over him. She barked at him. He wouldn't even look at her. She ran around in front of him and laid down in the trail, acting like a cat ready to spring. Stiff-legged, he walked up close to her, stopped, and showed his teeth. I laughed out loud. I knew he wouldn't bite her any more than he would bite me. He was just acting tough because he was a boy dog. After several attempts to get him to play, little Anne gave up. Together they started sniffing around in the underbrush. As I walked up to the front of the store, Grandpa hollered at me from the barn. I went over to him. Right away, he wanted to know all about Reuben's accident. He listened while I told the story over again. After I had had my say, Grandpa stood looking down at the ground. There was a deep frown on his face and a hurt look in his eyes. His quietness made me feel uneasy. He finally raised his head, and looked at me. What I could see in his friendly old face tore at my heart. It seemed that there were more wrinkles than I had ever seen before. His uncombed iron gray hair looked almost white. I noticed that his wrinkled old hand trembled as he rubbed the wire-stiff stubble on his chin. In a low voice that quivered as he talked, he said, "Billy, I'm sorry about all this. Truly sorry. I can't help but feel that this was in a way my fault." "No, Grandpa," I said, "it wasn't your fault. It wasn't anyone's fault. It just happened and no one could help it." "I know," he said, "but if I hadn't called Reuben's bet, nothing would have happened. I guess when a man gets old, he doesn't think straight. I shouldn't have let those boys get under my skin." "Grandpa," I said, "Reuben and Rainey could get under anybody's skin. You couldn't help that. Why, they get under everyone's skin that gets close to them." "Yeah, I know," he said, "but still, I acted like a fool. Billy, I had no idea things were going to turn out like they did, or I wouldn't have called that bet." Wanting to change the conversation, I said, "Grandpa, we won that bet fair and square, but they took my money anyway." I saw the fire come back into his eyes. This made me feel a little bit better. He was more like the grandpa that I loved. "That's all right," he said. "We'll just forget the whole thing." He stepped over and laid his hand on my shoulder. In a solemn voice, he said, "We won't talk about this again. Now I want you to forget that it ever happened because it wasn't your fault." Oh, I know it's hard for a boy to ever completely forget something like that. All through your life, you'll think of it now and then, but try not to let it bother you, and don't you ever feel guilty about it. It's not good for a young boy to feel that way. I nodded my head, thinking of if people would just stop questioning me about Reuben's death, maybe I could forget about it. Grandpa said, "Well, the accident wasn't the only thing I wanted to talk to you about. I've got something else, something I think will help us both forget about a lot of things." The twinkle in Grandpa's eyes reminded me of what my father had said. Seems like that old man can cook up more deals than anyone in the country. I didn't care how many deals Grandpa cooked up. He was still the best grandpa in the whole wide world. "What you got?" I asked. "Come over to the store," he said, "and I'll show you." On our way over, I heard him mutter, "I hope this doesn't turn out like the ghost coon hunt." On entering the store, Grandpa walked to the post office department and came back with a newspaper in his hand. He spread it out on the counter. Pointing with his finger, he said in a loud voice, "Look." I looked. The large black letters read, "Championship Coon Hunt to be held." My eyes popped open, and again I read the words. Grandpa was chuckling. I said, "Boy, if that isn't something, a championship coon hunt." Wide-eyed, I asked, "Where are they having this hunt, and what does it have to do with us?" Grandpa was getting excited. Off came his glasses, and out came the old red handkerchief. He blew his breath on the lens and polished them. He snorted a time or two, reared back, and almost shouted, "Do with us? Why, it has everything to do with us. All my life I've wanted to go on one of these big coon hunts. Why, I've even dreamed about it, and now the opportunity has come. Yes, sir, now I can go." He paused. "That is, if it's all right with you." I was dumbfounded. I said, "All right with me? Well, Grandpa, you know it's all right with me, but what have I got to do with it?" Grandpa was so excited I thought he was going to burst a blood vessel. Talking excitedly, he said, "I've got it all fixed. Billy, we can enter Old Dan and Little Ann in this competition." I was so surprised at what Grandpa had said, I couldn't utter a word. At first, I was scared, and then a wonderful feeling came over me. I felt the excitement of the big hunt as it burned its way into my body. I started breathing like I had been running for 100 miles. After several attempts, I croaked, "Can just any dog be in this hunt?" Grandpa almost jumped as he answered, "No, sir, not just any hound can be entered. They have to be the best, and they have to be registered, too." He started talking with his hands. Pointing to a chair, he said, "Sit down and I'll tell you all about it." Grandpa calmed down a little and started talking in a serious voice. "Billy," he said, "it takes some doing to have a set of dogs entered in this hunt. I've been working on this for months. I've written letters on top of letters. I've even had several good friends in town helping me. You see, I've kept a record of all the coons your dogs have caught, and believe me, their catch is up there with the best of them. Now, I have already paid the entry fee and everything is fixed. All we have to do is go." "Entry fee? How much did it cost?" I asked. "You let me worry about that," he said. "Now what do you say? Want to give it a whirl? I understand the winner receives a gold cup, and you never can tell. We might come home with it. We have as good a chance as anybody." Grandpa had me so worked up by this time I didn't think anyone else had good hounds except for me. I reared back and blurted, "It's all right with me, Grandpa. Just tell me what to do." Grandpa flew out of gear like a Model T Ford. Simile. He slapped the counter with his hand. In a pent-up voice, he said, "That's a boy. That's the way I like to hear a coon hunter talk." With a questioning look on his face, he asked, "Didn't I see you come up with your dogs when you came?" "Yeah, they followed me. They're outside," I said. "Well, call them in. I've got something for them." I called to them. Little Ann came in the store, walking like she was scared. Old Dan came to the door and stopped. I tried to coax him in. It was no use. My dogs, never being allowed in the house at home, were scared to come inside. Grandpa walked over to a block of cheese and cut off 2 chunks about the size of my fist. He walked to the door, talking to Old Dan. "What's the matter, boy? You scared to come in? Well, that shows you're a good dog." He handed him a piece of cheese. I heard it rattle in his throat as he gulped it down. Grandpa came back and set Little Ann up on the counter. He chuckled as he broke the cheese up in smaller pieces and fed her. "Yes, sir," he said, "I think we have the best coon hounds in these Ozark Mountains, and just as sure as shooting, we're going to win that gold cup." Grandpa didn't have to say that. The way I was feeling, I already had the cup. All I had to do was go get it. Finished with his feeding of Little Ann, Grandpa said, "Now let's see. The hunt starts on the 23rd. That's about, well, let's see. This is the 17th. Counting on his fingers, he finally figured it out. "That's 6 days from now," he said in a jubilant voice. I nodded my head. "We can leave here early on the morning of the 22nd, he said, "and barring any accidents, we should make it to the campground in plenty of time for the grand opening." I asked how we were going. "We can go in my buggy," he said. "I'll load the tent and everything the night before." I asked him what he wanted me to bring. "Nothing," he said, "but these 2 little hounds, and you be here early, and I believe I'd let these dogs rest. We want them to be in tip-top shape when we get there." I saw the thinking wrinkles were bunched up on Grandpa's forehead. "You reckon your daddy would like to go with us, too?" "As late in the fall as it is, I don't think he's too busy, is he?" "No, our crops are all gathered," I said. "We've been clearing some of the bottomland, but that's almost done now." "Well, ask him," he said. "Tell him I'd like to have him go." I'll ask him, but you know how Papa is. The farm comes first with him. I know, said Grandpa, but you ask him anyway and tell him what I said. Now, it's getting late and you had better be heading for home. I was almost to the door when Grandpa said, wait a minute. He walked over behind the candy counter and shook out one of the quarter sacks. He filled it up to the brim, bounced it on the counter a few times, and dropped in a few more gumdrops. With a twinkle in his eye and a smile on his face, he handed it to me, saying, save some of this for your sisters. I was so choked up I couldn't say anything. I took it and flew out the door, calling to my dogs. On my way home, I didn't walk on the ground. I was way up in the clouds, skipping along. With a song, I told the sycamore trees and pop-eyed gray squirrels how happy I was. Little Ann sensed my happiness. She pranced along on the trail, and with a doggish grin on her face, she begged for a piece of candy, which I gladly gave to her. Even old Dan felt the pleasant atmosphere. His long red tail fanned the air. Once he raised his head and bawled. I stood still and listened to the drowning tones of his deep voice. The sound seemed to be trapped for an instant in the thick timber. It rolled around under the tall white sycamores, beat its way through the wild cane, and found freedom out over the clear blue waters of the river. The sound, following the river's course, rolled like the beat of a jungle drum. Lots of similes in this chapter. As the echo died away in the distance, silence settled over the bottoms. The gray squirrels stopped their chattering. The wild birds quit their singing. I stood still. No sound could be heard. It seemed that all the creatures of the wild were holding their breath. I gazed up to the towering heights of the tall trees. No leaf was stirring. The silence seemed strained and expectant, like a young boy waiting for a firecracker to explode. I looked at old Dan. He was standing perfectly still, with his right front foot raised and his long ears fanned open. He seemed to be listening and challenging any living creature to make a noise. The silence was broken by the whee of a red-tailed hawk. This seemed to be a signal. All around me, the happy atmosphere resumed in its natural state. We're going to stop there for now.